A baby camel was sitting with his mother one day when curiosity got the best of him. "Mom, why do we have these huge three-toed feet?" "Well, my son," the mother replied, "when we trek across the desert, our wide feet help us stay on top of the soft sand." The baby camel thought for a moment before asking, "Then why do we have these long eyelashes?" "Ah," the mother said, "our eyelashes protect our eyes from the sand during desert storms." Nodding, the baby camel asked one last question. "And what about these big humps on our backs?" "Those," the mother said proudly, "store water so we can survive long journeys without drinking." The baby camel paused, looked around, and finally asked, "Then why are we in the San Diego Zoo?" Deep in the tropical waters of the Caribbean, two prawns named Justin and Christian swam together, constantly living in fear of the sharks that roamed the reef. One day, Justin sighed and said, "I'm sick of being a prawn. If only I were a shark, I'd have nothing to worry about." Suddenly, a mysterious cod appeared in a flash of light and boomed, "Your wish is granted!" And just like that, poof! Justin transformed into a mighty shark. Horrified, Christian swam away, terrified of his former best friend. As time passed, Justin realized that life as a shark was lonely. His old friends fled at the sight of him, and he missed the companionship he once had. Regretful, he searched for the wise old cod and pleaded, "Please, turn me back into a prawn. I just want my old life back." The cod granted his wish, and Justin found himself a prawn once again. Overjoyed, he swam back to the reef and invited his friends for a cocktail. But when he looked around, he noticed Christian was missing. "Where's Christian?" he asked. "He's at home," one prawn replied. "He's still heartbroken that you became a shark." Determined to make things right, Justin swam to Christian's coral home and knocked on the door. "Christian, it's me! I've changed! Come out and see me!" From inside, Christian shouted back, "No way, man! You're a shark and I'm not falling for your tricks!" With tears in his eyes, Justin called out, "No, really, I'm not a shark anymore! I found cod! I'm a prawn again, Christian!" Two bees bumped into each other in midair. "Hey, how's it going?" asked the first bee. The second bee sighed. "Not great. The weather's been awful. Wet and damp. No flowers, no pollen. I can't make any honey." The first bee nodded sympathetically, then said, "No problem. Just fly down 5 blocks, take a left, and keep going until you see all the cars. There's a bar mitzvah happening, tons of fresh flowers and fruit." "Really? That's amazing! Thanks for the tip!" The second bee buzzed off. A few hours later, they ran into each other again. "So how'd it go?" asked the first bee. "Fantastic," said the second bee. "You were right. Tons of flowers, loads of pollen. I hit the jackpot." The first bee smiled, then did a double take. "Wait, what's that thing on your head?" The second bee adjusted the tiny cap and said, "Oh, this? It's my yarmulke." "But you're not Jewish." The second bee shrugged. "Nah, but I didn't want them thinking I was a wasp." Mike and Dave were deep in the wilderness, enjoying a peaceful hike through the mountains. The air was crisp, the sun warm, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Dave suddenly froze. "Mike," he whispered, his voice trembling. Mike followed his gaze and saw it. A massive, hungry-looking bear emerging from the trees. Its dark eyes locked onto them. It let out a low growl and started charging. Panic surged through Dave. "What do we do? There's nowhere to climb!" he gasped. Without a word, Mike dropped his backpack, pulled out a pair of sneakers, and started lacing them up. Dave gawked at him. "Are you seriously putting on running shoes? You can't outrun a bear!" Mike stood up, stretched his legs, and gave a sly grin. "I don't have to outrun the bear," he said, tightening his laces. Dave blinked. "I just have to outrun you." A man walks up to a woman at a bar and says, "I bet I can make your cheeks blush." She scoffs and replies, "Oh yeah? My husband would have something to say about that." The man smirks and continues, "And then I bet I can turn you upside down, pour soda down your back, and drink it all without spilling a drop." Shocked, she gasps, "That's it. I'm telling my husband, and he's going to make sure you regret saying that." Fuming, she storms home and tells her husband, "Some guy at the bar said he could make my cheeks blush." Her husband clenches his fists. "That's it. I'm going down there to straighten him out." But before he can leave, she adds, "And then he said he could turn me upside down, pour soda down my back, and drink it all." Her husband suddenly stops, thinks for a second, then calmly takes off his jacket and sits back down. "Wait, what are you doing?" she asks. He shakes his head and mutters, "I'm not messing with a guy who can drink that much soda." Old Mr. Jenkins had spent his entire life pinching pennies, and he wasn't about to let death change that. He'd always scoffed at the saying, "You can't take it with you when you die." Determined to prove everyone wrong, he came up with a plan. One evening, he called his wife, Martha, into the bedroom and laid out his brilliant idea. "Martha," he said, "when I pass, I want you to go to the bank, withdraw as much cash as you can fit into 2 pillowcases, and leave them in the attic, right above our bed. That way, when my soul rises to heaven, I can just reach out and grab them on my way up." Martha sighed, but knowing her husband's stubbornness, she humored him. She did exactly as he asked, placing the stuffed pillowcases in the attic. Weeks later, after the funeral and all the formalities, Martha found herself up in the attic, dusting and sorting through old boxes. As she moved things around, she suddenly stumbled upon the 2 pillowcases, still sitting untouched, bursting with cash. She shook her head and let out a deep sigh. "Oh, that old fool," she muttered. "I told him he should have had me put the money in the basement." Susan woke up feeling perfectly normal, until she stretched. As she reached her arms above her head, she heard a faint clink on the hardwood floor. Blinking in confusion, she looked down and saw a penny lying between her feet. "Well, that's odd," she muttered, but shrugged it off and continued with her morning routine. As she walked into the kitchen to make coffee, she suddenly felt something shift. Plink. A nickel dropped to the floor. Now she was really puzzled. She picked it up, staring at it like it held the answer to some great mystery. "Huh," she murmured, shaking her head. "That's weird." Determined to carry on with her day, she poured herself a cup of coffee and went to brush her teeth. As she leaned over the sink, she felt a tiny ping against her ankle. Looking down, she saw a dime rolling away. Her heart started to race. "All right," she told herself. "If anything else happens, I am calling the doctor." She got dressed, hoping to put the strange occurrences behind her, and started tidying up around the house. As she bent down to pick up a magazine, she felt one final clunk. A quarter tumbled down her pant leg and onto the floor. That was it. She grabbed the phone and dialed her doctor in a panic. "Doctor, something very strange is happening," she said breathlessly. "First a penny fell out of me, then a nickel, then a dime, and now a quarter." There was a brief silence on the other end before the doctor calmly replied, "Nothing to worry about, Susan. You're just going through the change." Mrs. Thompson, a sweet elderly woman, walked into a small grocery store that also sold jade trinkets. The shopkeeper, Mr. Patel, greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, dear lady. What can I get for you today?" Mrs. Thompson adjusted her glasses and peered at the produce. "I'd like 7 kilograms of potatoes, please," she said. "Of course," Mr. Patel said, reaching for a large sack. "Oh, no," Mrs. Thompson interrupted, wagging a finger. "I need each potato wrapped individually, if you don't mind." Mr. Patel hesitated for a second, but nodded politely. "Certainly," he said, carefully wrapping each potato one by one. After what felt like an eternity, he finally finished. "There you go, ma'am. Anything else?" Mrs. Thompson tapped her chin. "Yes, I'll have 4 kilograms of onions." Mr. Patel reached for another sack, but before he could begin, she added, "And please wrap each onion individually, too." His smile wavered, but he nodded and got to work, methodically wrapping each onion while Mrs. Thompson hummed cheerfully. By the time he finished, his patience was wearing thin. "Anything else?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "Why, yes," she chirped. 7 kilograms of carrots, please." Mr. Patel sighed. "Let me guess. You want them wrapped individually?" "Oh, that would be grand," she said with a beaming smile. Grumbling under his breath, he painstakingly wrapped each carrot. His fingers ached, his enthusiasm had long since vanished, and he was certain this was the most exhausting sale of his life. Finally, he packed everything in a bag and handed it to her, hoping she was done. But then, Mrs. Thompson pointed to some crates behind the counter. "And what do you have in those?" she asked curiously. Mr. Patel turned bright red. "Madam," he said through gritted teeth, "those are grapes and they are not for sale." It was a bright Sunday morning, and the congregation had just finished a particularly inspiring church service. As the preacher closed his Bible and prepared to dismiss everyone, a familiar figure stood up. Rick, the wealthiest man in town. The preacher sighed. He knew Rick loved the spotlight. "Make it quick, Rick," he said, rubbing his temples. Rick smiled, cleared his throat, and addressed the congregation. "I just want to share a little story," he began, his voice dripping with importance. "I remember the day I earned my very first dollar. That same evening, I attended a church meeting, much like this one, where a speaker talked about his humanitarian work. At the time, that single dollar was all I had to my name. I faced a tough decision, keep it for myself, or donate it to his cause." The room fell silent as Rick let the suspense build. Then, with a dramatic pause, he continued. "I chose to give it away, every single cent, and I truly believe that because of that act of faith, God blessed me abundantly, which is why I stand before you today, a millionaire." A tear glistened in his eye as he looked around, waiting for the inevitable applause. Then, from the back of the church, an elderly woman slowly stood up, adjusting her hat. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called out, "Well then, I dare you to do it again!" The room was dimly lit, the soft beeping of medical monitors filling the air. An elderly man lay on his deathbed, his frail hand clasped in his wife's. She gazed at him with love and sorrow, knowing their time together was slipping away. With a weak breath, he mustered the strength to speak. "Honey," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm almost out of time, and there's something I'd like you to do for me when I'm gone." Tears welled in her eyes as she squeezed his hand. "Of course, my love. Anything you ask, I'll make sure it's done." He swallowed, gathering his last ounces of energy. "I want you to marry my old buddy, Jacob." She blinked in shock. "Jacob? But I thought you couldn't stand him." A slow, mischievous smile crept across the old man's face as he whispered his final words. "That's precisely why."